We want to thank everyone for joining us today for this conversation about the Black Liberation Movement. My name is Yohuru Williams. I'm the founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas, and I'm pleased to be your host for today. Today, we'll be talking about how the murder of George Floyd has catapulted Minneapolis to the epicenter of the Black Liberation Movement. But we'll be unpacking exactly what we mean by Black Liberation and the Black Liberation Movement with three distinguished scholars. But to begin with, we would like to offer the land acknowledgement, which is central to programs such as this. And so we want to begin by recognizing that we are on the ancestral homelands of the Dakota and Ojibwe people. And we want to pay our respects to elders, past and present. We would also like to honor the past, present, and ongoing efforts of the Dakota and Ojibwe people to steward and care for this land. It's now my distinct honor to introduce to you our panelists for today. And we'll begin with Dr. Terry Ann Scott, who is an author, associate professor of American history, and director of African American studies at Hood College in Maryland. She's received numerous awards and recognitions for her research, teaching, and community outreach, and is heavily involved in community service and social activism. Next up, we'd like to welcome to the program Dr. Peniel Joseph, who is the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and professor of history and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at the University of Texas at Austin. Time magazine recently named his book, The Sword and the Shield, and Stokely a Life, a must-read book for 2020. It's actually The Sword and the Shield was named a must-read for 2020. You should check it out, fantastic book. Last but not least, we'd like to invite no stranger to the Minnesota Historical Society, Dr. Keith Mays, who is associate professor in the Department of African American and African Studies at the University of Minnesota. Professor Mays is an expert on African American history, primarily from the 1960s to the present. He has an expertise on social and political movements and current issues of race and perception. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's jump right into this because we talk about Minnesota, Minneapolis being the epicenter, Minnesota being the epicenter of this national reckoning with race. And yet at the same time, we know that this is a long struggle that we talk about. Let's deal with this concept of Black liberation to begin with. And I'm going to ask you to unpack that for us a little bit, Dr. Scott. What do we mean? What do scholars mean when they distinguish between Black liberation and a Black liberation movement?
Well, a couple of things. First, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you and to talk about this really important topic. When we talk about Black liberation movements, I think often general individuals think about it in terms of being centered on the civil rights movement, very specifically the modern civil rights movement. When we think about it more broadly, we understand that the modern civil rights movement is simply one episode on a historical continuum of a push against white supremacy, a push to dismantle oppression. And so if we want to think about the Black liberation movement in this country and the long history of it, really we need to go back to the shores of West Africa, for instance, when 1 in 10 slave ships experienced rebellion. We need to reperiodize what we mean by civil rights and by a civil rights movement and by Black liberation movement to understand that all of these different episodes, when people were pushing against the boundaries of white supremacy, when people were pushing to create a movement where Black humanity was recognized, where Black lives were valued, that is something that has been woven throughout the history of Africans in America.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. Keith, Dr. Mays, let me pick up with you there, because when we talk about this in the context of Minnesota, a northern state, for example, there is this perception that still persists in a lot of spaces that somehow the North was immune from this. You have written extensively and talked about in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, this perception of Minnesota as a progressive state where these weren't issues. Can you talk about the context of the struggle for Black equality in the context of Minnesota in particular?
Absolutely, Dr. Williams. Thank you for inviting me. And I agree with Dr. Scott. I mean, it's essentially no different. When we talk about the Black freedom struggle, the Black liberation movement in the United States, it's a national movement as well as international. It's not local. or regional, local being, i.e. Minnesota or Alabama or Mississippi, or regional being South. It is a movement for the struggle of freedom and equality for Black people in the United States. Minnesota represented and mirrored every other aspect of oppression and white supremacy that you found in all corners of the country here. So prior to statehood, in the 1850s, African Americans were part of this territory, but as they struggled for freedom and equality around areas of voting rights, housing, education, we see the same kinds of manifestations of white supremacy that we see in other parts of the country. And so, yes, this is a space that's understood as the great liberal bastion, the upper Midwest, but that belies the history of Black Americans and what they had to face and endure here over the course of 150, now 170 some odd years here. So Minnesota is not a special place. It may be a special place for white radicals because this is the home of people like Wellstone and others, but it is not, and it's really had a vibrant white labor movement here. And I don't want to take away from that because you do find a lot of white folks who were between the two world wars played significant roles in the labor movement and the civil rights movement in Minnesota. And they fought for public accommodations. They went south and participated in some of the movements in the southern states during the 50s and 60s. So not to take that away, but African Americans were fully oppressed in the ways that we see in other parts of the country.
Appreciate that, Dr. Mays. Thank you. Dr. Joseph, you have a book out now, The Sword and the Shield, which is magnificent in its presentation of two leaders who we see as part of the continuum that Dr. Scott and Dr. Mays have talked about, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And you actually describe them, the revolutionary lives of these individuals. I want you to unpack something for us. In the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, Al Sharpton, in his eulogy here in June, said, "The story of George Floyd has been the story of Black folks in America." Can you weave that through the lives of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X in terms of contextualizing these issues as being both part and parcel of a movement, but also the individual experience of racial oppression that these distinguished leaders had as well?
No, absolutely. To really try to just build upon all the great things that our colleagues have said, Dr. Scott and Dr. Mays. When we think about George Floyd, there's a through line between George Floyd and Black people just here in the United States. So when we think about African American history, and I'm working on a larger project now about African America's third Reconstruction, right? And when you look at the first and second Reconstructions, there are so many Black women and men and boys and girls who are going to be killed and assaulted, even if we start the timeline after 1865 and after the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December of 1865. So George Floyd is really this through line. And in a way, I think what's striking for us, and I think this is why we all have to come to terms with these three reconstructions, as I call them, and we're in the middle of this third one. But what's striking is that there were always, and all the scholars here know, but part of our profession is teaching. But during these three reconstructions, and obviously during all of American history, but I would argue during these three reconstructions especially, there have always been these striking juxtapositions. Always, right? So alongside of the Emancipation Proclamation and the ratification of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, Juneteenth, right here in Texas, where I live, right? There's going to be people who are being massacred in the context of Juneteenth, right, in Galveston and other places, right? And so you're going to have the Frederick Douglasses, and you're going to have so many different, Black women leaders. When you think about Martha Jones's book Vanguard, when you think about the work of Deborah Gray White, when you think about so many Black women, and of course men, but I say Black women in particular, just because they're part of that public sphere too, even though they couldn't hold elected office because the 15th Amendment only allows Black men to vote. But so when you look at it, there were always a few things. There was always Black women and men who were leaders, church leaders, educators, political leaders, sororities, fraternities, farm workers and labor cooperatives, always, right? At the same time, there's also anti-Black violence within that context. And that's what people have a hard time. And I push back against my fellow historians. I look at Reconstruction as a 3-decade period, a little over 3 decades, all the way from 1865 till the Wilmington white supremacist riot of 1898. You know, because and that's how I formulate it in the book too. And I also look at the second Reconstruction, not just the heroic period of the civil rights movement from 54 to 68. I really look at it as a phenomenon that starts in the late 30s, early 1940s, March on Washington movement, Pan-Africanist, racial integrationist, Black feminist movements. So it's Ella Baker, it's Robeson, it's Du Bois, right? Septima Clark, even before the 50s and 60s. And then it goes into the narrative we know about Rosa Parks, Emmett Till, King, Malcolm, Martin, right? And then when you look at those two periods, though, 1860s all the way to the 1890s, sometimes we mistake what Rayford Logan called the nadir of our history as just being one thing. Even during the nadir, during lynching, we still were organizing and uplifting ourselves. And it wasn't all just the politics of respectability that sometimes we talk about and focus on, right? It was grassroots organizing. So you've got great work by Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham and Betty Collier Thomas on Black women, Black church women. But when you look at Stephen Hahn's work, A Nation Under Our Feet, you see people organizing. And it's not just Stephen Hahn, it's Stephen Kantrovitz, it's so many different other scholars, right? When we look at this, Dinah Ramey Berry, right? And the price for the pound of flesh, but even her other work. And so I think what we need to be thinking about when we think about the through line between the late 19th century, the racial pogroms of the early 20th century, and call them what they were in terms of Elaine, Arkansas. There's going to be pogroms in Minnesota too. They're everywhere, Texas too, right? Maryland, where Dr. Scott is at too, right? Those pogroms and the killing of Black women, children, sometimes take away, and Brian Stevenson has erected this memorial, 6,500. Well, the former Union Army and then politician, Black, Robert Smalls, he estimates over 50,000 Black people died, right? And we see that Asala just awarded the prize, and I was teaching that book, From Here to Equality, by Kirsten Mullen, Dr. Mullen, and Darity, right? So one of the things we see is those juxtapositions. So where does Floyd fit in? Floyd fits in with these shocking juxtapositions of anti-Black racism and white supremacy. But we've always had Michelle Obama and Barack Obama. Barack is only a little bit new because his dad was from Kenya. And if you go back to 1870, we're not going to have a bunch of folks who are saying, look, my dad is from Kenya just from a couple of years ago. You know what I mean? That's a little different, but we've always had those folks. So we have this feast or famine, and George Floyd becomes this recipient of state-sanctioned violence and white supremacy. The positive for all of us and how Minneapolis and Minnesota became the hotbed is that George Floyd is the first time in American history that an anonymous Black man, his murder inspires the kind of massive social disruption, the largest social movement and mobilization in American history, 15 to 26 million people. And this is happening not because of a Dr. King or a Fannie Lou Hamer or Angela Davis, or people who we say, hey, these are these famous people we revere. Most of us hadn't heard of George Floyd before that. Do you see what I'm saying? So that's the positive, but that's the through line in terms of this Black liberation struggle. And it goes way back. And obviously our history predates our incapacitation in North America. So we have to remember that too, right? We have this long, deep, beautiful history where we're in West Africa. Yeah, we have complexities there. I'm not saying we were all kings, right? But we had our own history. We had our own ethnic differences within Africa, and then we were snatched. We have to remember that. And that Malcolm teaches us that, right? And then King comes along for the ride too. So much of this is connected to racial slavery and its afterlife, which we continue to be burdened by right now.
Great, thank you, Dr. Joseph. I want to go back and talk about this history of what Dr. Joseph referred to as the pogroms that took place against people of color, African Americans, talking about Elaine, Arkansas, talking about Chicago, Tulsa, 1921. Dr. Scott, there's been some discussion post-George Floyd about being nuanced in our use of the term lynching. You have some people who have described the murder of George Floyd as a lynching. You have others who said, look, that refers to a very specific type of violence. And yet there are comparisons to be made there. Unpack that for us. What's the nuance in that conversation?
So personally, I see very little nuance. I have written about and classified the murder of George Floyd, the murder of Elijah McClain, the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, all as modern lynchings. And a reminder that lynching is not a relic of the Jim Crow past, that lynching is a very modern occurrence. So if we want to think about it very logistically, at one point in 1941, a number of anti-lynching organizations and individuals got together at Tuskegee University to try to come to some type of consensus about what exactly constituted lynching. And they had different variations on what they wanted to kind of put down on paper to say what it was. There had already been a number of organizations, the NAACP, the Chicago Tribune, and also Tuskegee itself, who were the three central collecting organizations for information. And that's what many scholars have used since then. The EJI and other scholars have then added on, myself included, I focus on Texas on lynching, have then added on to those numbers. But at that conference, they came up with a few things that they could agree upon. One of them, loosely or so, they said a lynching has to involve at least 3 or more people. And so the other two things that they said it had to do is to be in the mind of the lynchers, it had to serve some sort of justice, either to society or to race. And you had to have a body that was deceased. Now, some recent scholars have fudged that a bit, have said, well, the body doesn't necessarily have to be deceased and have added on to that. So I have taken that definition from the Tuskegee Conference and I apply it to my own work. And I do nuance it a bit in saying that, for instance, in the state of Texas, the other thing that adds to the horrific nature of racial terror lynchings is this idea that the people who are lynching African-American bodies have a lack of fear of punishment. And the lack of fear of punishment, because they are not held accountable for what they're doing, actually reproduces these acts and makes them even increasingly heinous. It is why, for instance, you can have a group of individuals burn a Black body during the middle of the day. That is a time-consuming effort to create the funeral pyre, to burn the body, to wait for the ashes to cool, to sift through the ashes for corporal souvenirs or other souvenirs from the site of the lynching, and then within days following, to tour that, and then to take pictures and have those pictures commuted to postcards and distributed without a fear of retribution. So if we then take it to some of the modern lynchings that we saw in 2020 and then with Elijah McClain in 2019, we have those same elements. We have the group of 3 or more individuals. We have what I would add is this lack of fear of punishment. We have people acting in what they thought was a service to society or to race. And we have another element that wasn't part of the Tuskegee Institute conversation, but we see nonetheless. We have sanctioning by the coroners and by the district attorney and the judges saying this is okay. In the case of George Floyd, we know, for instance, that the first autopsy report that came out did not lend any culpability to the police officers. And in fact, allowed enough room for people to wrongly say, oh, he may have actually died from COVID, just right there on the street. Nonsensical as that is, that's the space that it left. We see the same thing with Elijah McClain, that the district attorney says, well, the autopsy was not conclusive, and therefore I'm not going to press charges against these individuals. And initially with Ahmaud Arbery as well. And so with Ahmaud Arbery's case, when the district attorney who first had it said he doesn't see anything wrong with what they were doing, they were acting in service to society, chasing somebody they thought was breaking into homes. And the only person that he had any admonishment towards was actually Ahmaud Arbery's mother for asking that the case be taken away from him. It wasn't until, and this is the power of the moment that we're in now, it wasn't until public outcry and exposure of what was happening that the 3 men who murdered Ahmaud Arbery were ever arrested. And that speaks then to the importance of protest. to the importance of unity, to the importance even of social media and exposing the wickedness of what's happening on a local level to get people to act.
You know, it's fascinating to hear you unpack that, Dr. Scott. I'm looking forward to that book. Can you give us a title very quickly? It'll be out in the fall, as I understand.
Yes, absolutely. It's called Lynching and Leisure, Race and the Transformation of Mob Violence in Texas.
And to your point earlier, going back to what Dr. Joseph said, which I think is fascinating, when Dr. Joseph is making that distinction between a first, second, and third Reconstruction, we know during the first Reconstruction, the reason that the Ku Klux Klan has to wear robes and hoods is because they fear retribution, punishment by virtue of the law. Enforcement Act of 1870, the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. By the time people are sifting through the ashes in those photographs that we associate with the early 20th century, there is no fear of retribution. And I love the fact that you bring that forward in talking about the affirmation by the coroner and other attributes of society that co-sign in that violence. Professor Mays, let's talk about the Louvre. Because the interesting thing here was, in the aftermath of the Floyd murder, we were also marking the anniversary of the Duluth lynchings of 1920. And you offered some masterful commentary on the connection between Duluth, 1920, Juneteenth, George Floyd, and this history of violence and resistance to violence in the African-American community. I realize that's very broad, but I hope you could share some of that analysis with us as we're linking these things together today.
No, I think that what you guys have talked about already is spot on. I mean, in many ways, the reasons why Black folks are the victims of extra legal activity, and that's what this is because excuses will always be given as to why white people, ordinary white people, as well as those who are in law enforcement, must move on Black bodies in the way that they did in 1920 and the way they did in 2020 with George Floyd. Certainly when Dr. Joseph talked about the through line, he's absolutely right. And Dr. Scott is spot on when she says that that in many ways, the ebb and flow, the serve and volley of Black progress and Black regress has everything to do with the extra legal activity of white folks. And I teach my students this all the time, is that we have always been in a serve and volley from 1619 to the present. What we think is progress. And I know that we focus on the 1960s often, and that in many ways, Black progress has been, or we understand it to be linear, that it just continues to move straightforwardly without any impediments put into its place. And I know I think we were blinded by the election of Barack Obama. But make no mistake about it, the Tea Party revolution that took place 2 years after Barack was elected was a form of backlash politics. And certainly that movement that we laughed about, right, that was also violent, right? It was a protest movement. They called it a revolution, even in 2010. When they were able to parlay that into congressional seats and then become the Tea Party in Congress, we also didn't understand what that move was all about. And then when it coalesced into the election of Donald Trump, we still were kind of, well, this is kind of an aberration. This is an anomaly. This is not going to stop Black progress in the ways in which we understand it. But it wasn't until January 6th that we realized that, this is a serious problem. And what's a serious problem? It's what white folks always tap into when they no longer can win at the ballot box. And as I said last June, when I was interviewed after George Floyd was murdered, I said that they don't have enough voter suppression tactics to stop this movement, knowing that it was going to culminate in his defeat in November. And I predicted that even if Donald Trump is defeated, white folks will tap in to that toolbox that they always fall into when they want to stop Black progress, and that's to start killing folk, right? So this is a feature of the system in a way that I think that we don't understand. And when I say we, I mean maybe even us on this panel, because all of us are not old enough to actually live through the civil rights movement, but we research it, we write about it, we teach it through books and from books but we are living through the third Reconstruction. We were not around during the second Reconstruction. Certainly we were not around for the first Reconstruction. But it's amazing to actually be a part of a movement in real time and to actually see this taking place. And so what I would say about Duluth in 1920, it caught Minnesotans off guard in 1920. It also caught us off guard as well in 2020 when we witnessed the murder of George Floyd on the streets of South Minneapolis. And I think that if we don't think about progress and regress and how it takes place in American society, we will always be caught flat-footed by the responses of white folks when it comes to extra-legal mob violence.
I appreciate your commentary on that on so many levels, Professor Mays, because I think about Roy Wilkins' 1924 article in The Messenger, where he's talking about life in Minnesota, and he warns that the Duluth lynching will only have resonance for the Black community in Duluth, because the state got to walk away from that, partly from the things that, Dr. Scott was describing, but more so, and I love the way, particularly this summer, you were clear in connecting that to this kind of larger trajectory, which we saw play out on January 6th and the symbols that were part of that insurrection at the Capitol, the Confederate flag and the noose, both symbols of racial terror, which again, we associate with that period after the Civil War and this desire to maintain white supremacy at all costs. Dr. Joseph, a couple of years ago, you wrote a phenomenal book on Barack Obama, which I wanted to hope we would have time to talk about today, but I have to ask you to comment on something slightly different. How does Black Lives Matter as a movement fit into the conversation about Black liberation in the United States and globally today? How are we to connect the work of Black Lives Matter activists to what we're seeing now? And what is the best way to understand that as part of the continuum we've been all talking about this afternoon?
Yeah, I want to start with something that Dr. Mays said. I think that for those of us, I'm 48, who are not old enough to have been around when, say, Malcolm X was around. We definitely have participated in these movements. I was on my first picket line in elementary school. My mother was a trade unionist, 1199 SCIU, East 92nd Street. So I've been part of these movements since I was 7 or 8 years old. And that's how I grew up in a household of Haitian activists, Haitian American activists who were fluent in 4 languages. My mom's a feminist. She taught us about CLR James, the Black Jacobins, Toussaint Louverture, and the whole works, right? And so for those of us who grew up in New York City, we were at protests against police brutality way before Black Lives Matter. We were right there with so many different Black women and men who were grassroots leaders, who were part of the church, also secular, people who had been connected to political prisoners, who were Panthers and Young Lords and all kinds of things in the 1960s. So on some levels, I think it's important for us to remember that these movements, when we study social movements, we're studying high points in a continuum. So sometimes people will say, what happened to the movement? Those are only people who are not active, right? Because the movements never end. So everybody who's saying, and sometimes, back in the day, it would be Cosby, sometimes Oprah has said this, where are the people and stuff? They're not where you're at. They're not where you're hanging at. They're not at your fundraiser. These Black women who are part of everything from critical resistance, Black men too, are part of Pan-African and radical organizations, left organizations, interracial, feminist, queer. They don't start with Audre Lorde and they don't end with Audre Lorde or the Combee River Collective or Barbara Smith. That thing keeps going. And we have to remember, some people then, they'll be like, hey, I stopped my participation in the civil rights movement in Albany, Georgia in 1962. I was with Bernice Johnson Reagan. I was with and then I stopped after that. Cordell Reagan. But other people continue. So that's the thing about Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture. That's the thing about Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou is politicized 62. She continues to her death in 77. Other people participated for a year or two. And I'm not knocking them, but then they think the movement ended after they subsided. These movements continue. But here's the thing. What we study, a lot of times when we look at social movements, the fanciest, the most exciting thing to study is high points. That's why 2020 is going to be one of the most written about, and you all know it, years in American history. And it's not just us, because one of the reasons, because there's less of us as historians, Black historians, than there are white historians. One of the reasons why 2020 is going to be so big is because white historians are going to be looking at it, and scholars, right? That's because we don't flood the market. I want everybody to know, even though I got all these Black history books by Black women and men, there's even a ton more by white folks. I just want people to know we don't flood. That's why we're not like, it's not like the Academy 70% Black people, even though sometimes people think it is, just because, Black History Month and the visibility at times, right? So we have to remember that it continues. So the thing about this idea of a third Reconstruction, this idea of Barack Obama, where he fits in, what's important for us to remember is that Black history at its best resists this myth and this narrative of American exceptionalism, right? And the contradiction of Obama, but this is why he became president, is he embraces American exceptionalism. Him and Michelle do, because here's American exceptionalism is built on two lies. Right? The first lie is the lie of Black dehumanization that allows for racial slavery and the super exploitation of Black bodies in the first place, right? And justifies it. It justifies it, right? Scientific racism. We are this species of property. We are contraband. Dred Scott, Kansas, Nebraska. Okay, so that's the first lie. The second lie is that the first lie didn't happen. That's the second lie. It's a people were criticizing the Freedmen's Bureau when it came out as special treatment and HBCUs. And you're saying special treatment in 1865? Yes, special treatment in 1865, because that's based on a lie. Why are you being treated differently? This whole slavery thing didn't happen. They said that immediately. That's what we don't understand. Immediately that was said, way before affirmative action, way before all of it, right? So what the contradiction when you think about Obama and the Tea Party, and some of us spotted this, Dr. May, some of us spotted it. So it wasn't everybody drinking the Kool-Aid. Mm-hmm. Obama drank the Kool-Aid. That's how he got elected. He's a great politician. He's not a prophetic figure like Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr. He's not that, right? Many people mistook him for that. So embracing American exceptionalism, this is what it promises you. It promises a myth of self-correction. We messed up, but we can fix it. That's what it promises you. Okay, we did this bad thing at times, it acknowledges, but we fixed it through the Voting Rights Act. Won't talk about voter suppression. Won't talk about why the George Floyds and Breonna Taylors keep getting murdered, right? So it's lying and lying and lying. But if you go along with the lie, you can even be elected president. So it's a very seductive lie, right? Because these folks aren't going to elect you if you tell them systemic racism and white supremacy, yet I want to be your president to help you reconstruct the democracy. They're not going to elect Frederick Douglass, because that's what Frederick Douglass was doing. He's saying this, we have great potential, but I'm not going to tell lies. I'm going to tell the truth. That's what Dr. King, Fannie Lou Hamer is doing. Fannie Lou Hamer credentials Testimony Committee, August 1964. She says, is this America, land of the free, home of the brave, where we are beaten for trying to exercise our rights as human beings? That's what she says. My phone is ringing off the hook with hate and white supremacy. She's saying that. Fannie Lou Hamer should have been the governor of Mississippi, the senator of Mississippi, right? But when you speak truth to power, Fannie Lou Hamer never got to be that. She was she dies at 60, diabetic, right? Because of all these threats. So the big thing that we can do as scholars, as activists, is really expose those lies. And when you expose those lies, part of it, and we've seen it, Cori Bush and Ayanna Pressley and these progressive Black legislators, especially women, exposing the lies. Stacey Abrams exposing the lies. I'm not sure how high they're going to get to in the scaffolding of white supremacy when you're exposing these lies, right? But it's very important for us to do. And that's why Obama becomes somebody who people revere and admire, but we have to admit why Obama got elected. And remember, my final point is March 18, 2008, Obama saves his candidacy from Jeremiah Wright and Black liberation theology by making a claim there's a moral equivalency between racial slavery, right? racial slavery and white supremacist anti-Black sentiment and grievances against us, right? He said there was a moral equivalent. And what did the press say? They said it was the best speech on race since Lincoln. That's what we're in. That's what we're facing, right? You know, that's what we're facing. So it's extraordinarily important to stop the lies, even from people we admire. Do you see what I'm saying? And again, they continue the lies because Barack and Michelle, they've spoken to Black college students, telling them this bootstrap philosophy, right? How can you speak to graduates of Morehouse and act like they're Black deadbeat dads? That's racist. How can you speak to Black women at Spelman and other graduates and act like they're not taking care of their kids? That's not the group that's not taking care of their kids. And groups that aren't taking care of their kids, it's because of structural issues, not because of behavioral issues. It's because of deep structures of violence and inequality. So it's important for us to tell the truth. And I think the most important aspect of that Black liberation movement is that prophetic tradition of truth tellers, prophets who are often marginalized in their own time, right? People didn't want to hear people who are telling the truth at that level, right? When Dr. King starts speaking the truth, there are no more Nobel Prize winners. White folks hate Martin Luther King Jr. I want people to say, white folks hate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They hate Malcolm X. They hate Angela Davis. They hate Black women and men who are doing what? Telling them the truth. And the first thing they say, like Dr. Mays, once you start speaking too much, they start talking about what? Violence, arrest, violence, your death, right? And my last point is one of the reasons why they were wearing those hoods, Dr. Williams, Dr. Scott, Dr. Mays, you all know, is that it wasn't just the policy enforcement. We have Black folks who organized their own militia in Texas and other places. Steve Hahn talks about A Nation Under Our Feet. Du Bois talks about it in Black Reconstruction. We defended ourselves. We defended ourselves. Let's face it, because we don't have to say that that was a bad thing. We defended our lives because we value our lives. We value our community. We value our children. We value our women, our men, everybody, gay, straight. We defended ourselves, and we can't ever forget that. And the only way we move ahead with all this racist talk of civil war, we have to defend ourselves in this context too. This doesn't mean attack or violence. We're defending ourselves against white violence and racial terror.
To your point, Dr. Joseph, and I think we may have to take questions in a few minutes, but I often think about your point about the lie. The Supreme Court's decision in 1883 in the civil rights cases, where you've got Justice Bradley saying there has to be some time in the history where the Black community takes on the rank of mere citizens and ceases to be the special favorite of the law, and we're less than 10 years outside. And then 2 years later, you've got, to your point, Frederick Douglass talking about self-defense as the mechanism to defend African Americans from those types of racist attacks. So a hell of a history lesson there in a very short period of time. I am going to, because we only have 2 minutes before we're going to go to questions and answers, ask that we start to cue those up. But I do want to ask about, since you raised this question of self-defense, and since the movie Judas and the Black Messiah is out now, and many people have questions about organizations like the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. We'll begin with you, Dr. Scott. Can you speak to this importance of self-defense in the Black community and organizations that fall outside of what we would consider more mainstream civil rights goals that most people are accustomed to?
Absolutely. First, can I say, Dr. Joseph, my mother's from Haiti, so shout out to Haitian parents who raise their children to be socially conscious. So first and foremost. So when we think about these forms of self-defense, I'm really glad that Dr. Joseph brought that up, because I think that generally people assume, and I don't think I'm overstating this. I mean, we have the exception of assuming other things because we are scholars and we do this work and we think, well, this is a given. Everybody knows that that's not true. That the first time that an African-American moved against white supremacy and systems of violence was when Rosa Parks decided not to give up her seat on the bus. I think we may have all had students allude to that or say that straight up to us because that's what they're taught. And the people who teach them don't know any better or don't want to know any better or want to, as Dr. Joseph very aptly said, continue on with that lie. And so any kind of move of Black freedom expression, any kind of self-defense is met not only with a silencing, but often with a counteract of state-sanctioned violence. And so when we talk about, it's very important to understand that there are moments. You mentioned that when those people were putting on hoods, Black folks were defending themselves. The first thing that comes to my mind, and if people don't know about the story, they should look into it, is in Milliken, Texas, when African Americans in the late 1960s, or 1860s rather, 65 to 68, when the Klan, after its inception, started to move into their area because they were, God forbid, after the first Reconstruction Act to begin to have Black men vote in Texas. The Klan moves into their town and marches to instill fear in them. But what happened? They did it during church service, and all the Black folks in the church emptied out and came out and started shooting at those Klansmen. Now, am I saying that is what we need to do in this day? No, that's not what I'm saying. However, what we are understanding is that Black organization and a response to violence has often been necessitated by a lack of any other protection from the nation state. And so I think when we talk about, for instance, some of the Black power organizations from the 1960s, most prominently, you mentioned Judas and the Black Messiah, the Black Panther Party, well, they learned a lot of their cues from those who came before them, including somebody called Robert Williams from Carolina. And so I would encourage our listeners to read his book, Negroes with Guns, because he very aptly lays out how there's a nuance. You are not only speaking to nonviolence or violence, but very much in the vein of Malcolm X saying we are defending ourselves. And when he tried to engage in these very peaceful protests and it didn't work and people were getting murdered and Black women's rape by white men were going unchecked, he chose a different route and he becomes one of the individuals for whom Bobby Seale and Huey Newton looked to for inspiration for when they started the Black Panther Party. So there's a lot there as we pull back the curtains.
I mean, brilliant. Thank you, Dr. Scott. Dr. Mays, let's talk about cultural nationalism as a response and a form of defense. You've written extensively about Kwanzaa. You were at the forefront of conversations about Juneteenth here and the importance of African-American culture as a means of resistance. Can you unpack that for us and explain how that has been a mechanism by which the African-American community has sought a form of Black liberation and also supported efforts at Black liberation?
Absolutely. Liberation starts with the mind. And of course, those tensions that we all know about as African-Americanists within Black social movements about which way to go, whether we should be political activists or whether we should be cultural activists and nationalists, has been part of our culture for some time now. But there was a collection of activists and African Americans who really believed that we should not talk about politics writ large until we understand what it means to be a liberated person, right? So these folks identified sites of struggle that were beyond public accommodations and voting rights. You know, they identified the American calendar as a site of struggle. They identified the Black body as a site of struggle. And so these Black power activists, many of them cultural nationalists, believe that, you know, it's the way in which we understand ourselves from an identity perspective. It's the way we understand ourselves vis-a-vis other Black folks and the larger society. So yes, we need to celebrate differently. You know, even if that meant putting Black days next to dominant white ones on the calendar, or coming up with different rituals. And the ritual tradition of Black folks stretches all the way back to the 18th century. I mean, it's as old as Black folks in this country. But I would say one thing about nationalism, and people laugh at nationalism in the 21st century. And one of the things that we don't understand is that they understood something that we've lost. And I'm writing a book. I have a book coming out on education. And when they said, don't allow the enemy to educate your children, when they said that, even before the 60s, and certainly it was heightened during the 1960s, we didn't understand. We laughed at them. And I guarantee in retrospect, we would probably take heed to what they said, because the public schools are abysmal. So when they created Black independent schools, when they created freedom schools, or schools that were built around a certain kind of cultural nationalism and understanding who we are as Black people, we didn't understand that wresting control of the educational process meant that we would secure the future of Black people in a way that did not allow our young people to be so corrupted by an educational system that was designed not to teach them what it meant to engage in liberation struggle, right? So it's on the one hand, we're not the schools are not going to teach you to be conscious in the way that they understood it, but it's also not giving our young people the ability to participate in the larger society. And so, yes, I think that nationalism is still around. It's not dead, but I think that Black Lives Matter. You asked the question to Dr. Joseph that our movements are much more intersectional. Mm-hmm. But when we did take a race first position, it meant that we were going to privilege certain kinds of politics, and those politics were not good for Black women, for Black queer folks. But it did keep an emphasis on what this struggle was all about at the end of the day. And this is a racial struggle, and white folks will always remind you that this is a racial struggle. And so to me, that's what the tradition of Black nationalism is all about.
Thank you, Dr. Mays. We're going to take our first question, but before we do, Dr. Mays, the title of that forthcoming book?
Oh, the Unteachable Civil Rights, Disability Rights, and the Origins of Black Special Education. Due
out next year.
Yes.
Thank you. And then Dr. Scott, again, title of your book. I just want to make sure we get these in. The forthcoming book.
Sorry, I'm unmuting. Lynching and Leisure, Race and the Transformation of Mob Violence in Texas.
Great. And then if you have not gotten a copy of The Sword and the Shield by Peniel Joseph, let me tell you, because I had a chance to read the advanced copies, The Revolutionary Lives of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. It is beyond worth a read. Phenomenal piece of scholarship. We'll take our first question. So this is from Anna, who asks, if we are in a third Reconstruction today, as we mentioned, can you say a little bit more about how Minnesota history, its lies and its deeper truth, sheds a distinctive light on what the Northern or progressive Midwest version of history hides about the liberation and resistance work that must be done? And I'll open that to any of the panelists that wants to weigh in.
You know, I'll let Keith handle the specific Minnesota aspect. But what I would say is that, you know, every state, especially states that were part of the Union during Reconstruction, the first Reconstruction, new states that have been added are culpable in this history, you know, including white folks, especially white folks. So part of what it is that Reconstruction was supposed to be the dawn and the birth of a new freedom, multiracial democracy that would have transformed institutions and structures in the United States, from healthcare to finance capital. And no longer would Black people be super exploited. We shouldn't have had a convict lease system. We shouldn't have had sharecropping or peonage. We should have had citizenship and dignity, and we didn't get that. So where Minnesota fits in is that the afterlife of racial slavery is a very, very harsh reality of white supremacy and premature Black death, but those things go hand in hand. So all those nice neighborhoods and schools that you got in Minnesota are predicated on Black segregation and anti-Black racism. It goes hand in hand, right? And so the northern side of Reconstruction is the fact that white folks, whether it's from the North or South, always make a claim of racial fatigue, right? During BLM 1.0, they did, and since George Floyd, they still have. They get so tired of talking about race because they are constantly accruing the benefits of racial privilege, right? And the benefits are cascading and panoramic and intersectional. They connect to white folks with disabilities. They connect to white folks who have autism. They connect to white women with breast cancer in comparison to us, and maternal birth outcomes and asthma, okay? And so what you have to understand is just the history and the complicity, and that's why it's a rough history. I live in Texas now. I was born in New York. The answer to the question, what are the good places in the United States where it's less racist? The answer is there are none. That's what I'm telling you. There are none, right? So everybody who's making a claim, I live in Atlanta and I'm surrounded by, and I'm so good. There are places that might have more Black people, and that's great. That's great. Mm-hmm. But they have massive contradictions too, right? So the whole country, Alaska, Hawaii, the 48 contiguous states, everybody's in on it, right? And again, the way in which we've set up this country and this world up until today, the moment that we're talking about now, we've erected power and domination in high finance capital, the tech industry, who becomes president, the supply chains of power and privilege versus misery and grief are based on the super exploitation of Black people, the criminalization of Black people, the murder and marginalization of Black people. Even Black people who have money are producing the money for white people, for an enjoyment and a supply chain of white people. That's why the NFL is the way it is. You don't have any Black owners in the NFL. Don't you get it? And that's why they don't want Black general managers or even coaches to be part of a supply chain that provides parallel wealth and parallel power. Not at all. That's what we have to understand. Nixon, that's why Soul City didn't work. And when Nixon was supposed to say Black power is Black capitalism, what he found out, once you're trying to give Black people even access to federal money and stuff, even white folks in the liberal constituency said no, right? And there's some great work on this. That's what I'm saying. So we have to understand, Minnesota, you're complicit too. Wisconsin, you too. Indiana, especially you. Illinois, you too. The whole country. And that's why I'll end by saying this. Malcolm X, one of our prophets, he said anything south of Canada was the American South. He said the whole thing was the South. South of Canada. So we are the United States of South America. We're not America. It's South America. The South, the Confederacy, Stone Mountain, Georgia, all that humiliating, embarrassing history, that's all of us in the Midwest as well.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph. Dr. Mays, you want to weigh in on that?
No, I was going to say, I've been working with schools to create Black Studies curriculum for the last 10 years, and it's no different. The schools here, Peniel said that they're nice. That's putting it sort of kindly and mildly. The schools are abysmal at so many different levels, but at the level of the curriculum, it's no different from southern states. That you can't get a representation of people of color in the curriculum without a fight. And if you want to say that, well, why is that? Because you have progressive white folks who are teachers and administrators. It doesn't matter. You still have the same kind of ethos when it comes to white supremacy, is that we want to uphold what's already been in place. So yeah, for sure, that Minnesota is no different educationally than other parts of the country. And I would say we're probably different in the sense that we have actually some of the larger educational gaps in the country. White folks do well here educationally. Black folks do really, really poor. So that gap is much wider here than it is in other states.
Last, the union in educational outcomes for for African-American students, which is a great point. We'll take the next question. The problem is, and I'll say this as an editorial comment, they did not give me enough time with this panel, for sure. But this one comes from Chris Lehman. Thank you, panelists. In 1973, Mayor Maynard Jackson of Atlanta said, "Politics is the civil rights movement of the 70s." Has that statement aged well as of 2021? I want to begin with you, Dr. Scott, if you don't mind.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to make a comment about the last question, and I'll pass this question along. But just to brief comment to reiterate, I think often white folks historically and today have been very comfortable in thinking of the South as this kind of separate entity, its own world. And it comes as a surprise to many when they begin to think, oh, there is no Southern exceptionalism, that it required, for instance, the federal government to sanction the kind of racial terror and statutory claims to white supremacy that existed in the South. They could not have existed, not only with a turning of folks' backs to what was happening, but also with a series of Supreme Court rulings that said, okay, Williams versus Mississippi in 1898, and subsequent rulings to that said, yes, this is okay, we will allow for this to happen. And there's something else that people need to remember. Just because there may not have been signs in northern spaces that said colored only, doesn't mean it wasn't colored only. My own grandmother died in the Black section of a hospital in Hyde Park in Chicago in 1966. Now that's post the 1964 Civil Rights Act, when there shouldn't have been any signs like that at all. There were not signs. It was the way that it was arranged. And so there certainly is no Southern exceptionalism whatsoever. And I'll stop there and see if one of the panelists want to chime in on this particular question.
Before you jump in, Pinel had to leave. Where did he go?
Oh, there you go.
Because I know this is Pinel's wheelhouse here. I would say politics and the civil rights movement of the 1970s, for sure that's apropos today, and until white folks decide to change the rules. So yes, we don't actually access and we don't use politics in a way that even Byron said we should transform our protest to politics in that 1966 article, 67 article that he wrote. And certainly Maynard Jackson builds on that, which you saw in 2020, and the way that we came out certainly suggests that if we do things differently, we can harness political power to our advantage. But as you can see already with new kinds of voter suppression tactics, that white folks will decide to change the rules when we actually use our power in a way that we typically don't. I mean, we may show up every 4 years, but we don't show up every year, certainly not every 2. So I would say yes, but stay tuned.
You know, I would say that that statement hasn't aged well because of this. What Jackson and those folks didn't realize was that, and this happened during the first Reconstruction, happened during the second. Once you put such a primacy on electoral politics, the rules are going to be changed. And the only way Black people can participate in electoral politics is when you make the community central to building a political base. So you're not just building a political transactional machine. And it's like both Dr. Scott and Mays have been talking about, the thicker the community bonds in Lowndes County, Alabama, for instance, or Mississippi or Minnesota, the more you're going to have voter outreach and the more you're going to have people who want to be part of this civic activism, right? And I think Stacey Abrams and so many Black women organizers showed you that in Georgia. They created community bonds over years, not just fundraising, but they created community bonds and a community ethos. And again, so often when we're successful, Black women have been very, very centered and central to that success because they're connected to so many parts of the community in a panoramic way, even if they weren't always the one getting the massive photo op, right? So when we think about politics has to go beyond just the vote, where we set up church and civic and secular organizations. And we've been doing that, but a lot of times they're underfunded. So we look for our politicians to be violence disruptors, but the money we should be giving is to Black folks in the community, really led by women, including, like, if you say you want a Black bank, I'm all for it. But the person who really is going to know who really needs the money and how that's going to be distributed, it's not necessarily going to be in our poorest communities, somebody who has an MBA and went to school with us. It's going to be these different people who are community grassroots leaders. And I think one of the best aspects of cultural nationalism during the Black Power era was a realization of that. Because I think that the nationalism of the Black Power era is connected to the intersectional identity that an intersectional justice movement at its best, because it was expansive. It wasn't a narrow nationalism. It wasn't racist and anti-Semitic and anti-queer at its best. At its best, it wasn't that. In fact, at its best, think about David Walker and Mariah Stewart, and you think about Black feminists and Black nationalists of the late 19th century. They're walking hand in hand, including Frederick Douglass in a relationship with Ida B. Wells. Douglass is a nationalist. I don't care what anybody says. Douglass is a nationalist. You know what I'm saying? So people can push back against me, but Frederick Douglass is a nationalist. Okay. And he's right there with Ida B. Wells, because Douglass is not getting into, Douglass is also a feminist. He's a feminist, right? And so there's a way when we think about intersectional identity, one of the unsung heroes are nationalists of all stripes, right? Because nationalism is where we start to talk about our identity, but some people made it narrow nationalism. But not all nationalism is narrow national. Wilson Moses teaches us that. Lawrence Levine, Sterling Stuckey, right? Sadia Hartman, right? There's so much when you think about what is nationalism, it's more expansive than that, you know? So our politics have to be more expansive than that.
And unfortunately, we are at time. I think I am going to ask you're able to bring this panel back together just because it's been such a rich conversation. I'll also say if you want to learn more about Minnesota Black history, please check out the Minnesota Historical Society website, where you can pick up on not only great series like this, but our Black Voices series this month. Very quickly, one word, we're running out of time. Dr. Scott, where can you find your social media?
Let me turn my volume up. Did you say where can you find? Yeah, there you go.
Dr. Mays?
Prof_Mays or drkeithamays.com.
Great. And Dr. Joseph?
Oh, just at Peniel Joseph.
Wonderful. Please check out the resources of these incredible scholars. I want to thank all of you for your participation today. And I also want to say that please stay tuned because Minnesota Historical Society will be offering other parts of this series dealing with the question of Black liberation and Black empowerment. Make sure you check us out. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I can't wait for your books. We'll have you come to Austin.
Oh, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, I'm looking for my advanced copy, Dr. Scott.
Yeah, and mine of yours.
Yes, for sure.